Some crimes defy explanation. Not because the facts are unclear, but because the motive is so hollow, so senseless, that the human mind struggles to accept it. 3 people were killed inside their own home. A grandmother. A teenager. A 10-year-old girl. They were beaten to death. And the person responsible had eaten at their table. Had slept under their roof. Had been treated like one of their own. He did not come for money. He did not come for revenge. He came for shoes. This is the story of the Short family. And it is about to get worse than you think. January 4th, 2016. Columbus, Georgia. A quiet Monday morning in a suburb called Uppy. Children rode bikes in these streets. Neighbors waved from driveways. People left their doors unlocked without a second thought. It was that kind of neighborhood. And on the surface, nothing about the Short family home on Bentley Drive was unusual. Nothing, until a husband pulled into his driveway and felt something was wrong before he even stepped out of his car. What Robert Short discovered inside that house would shake the Columbus Police Department to its core. 3 members of his family were dead. The investigation that followed would expose a calculated, premeditated betrayal carried out by someone the family had welcomed with open arms. This is the story investigators say left even seasoned detectives in tears. To understand the weight of what happened, you first need to know who these people were. Because this was not just a crime scene. This was a family. Gloria Short was 54 years old. She had worked as a medical clerk for nearly 2 decades. But those who knew her would tell you that her real purpose in life was far simpler than any job title. She took care of people. If you came to her house, you left with a full plate of food. If a child in the neighborhood needed new clothes, Gloria made sure they had them. If someone needed to talk, she listened. Her daughter Shemika described her mother as the kind of woman who treated complete strangers like lifelong family. That generosity, that open-door spirit, was central to who Gloria Short was. It would also cost her everything. Robert Short, Gloria's husband, was a man built on discipline and service. He had spent 21 years in the military. After that, he became a nurse, working ICU night shifts from 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning. He cared for the sickest patients in the hospital, night after night, year after year. On January 4, 2016, Robert had just finished one of those shifts. He was driving home. He had no idea his world was already gone. Caleb Short was 17 years old. He was a junior at Spencer High School. Quiet by nature, preferring a small group of close friends to large social gatherings. He spent a lot of time on his Xbox. He loved basketball, though he had recently stepped back from playing. But there was one thing Caleb was passionate about. Sneakers. Jordan brand. Nike. High-end releases. He had built a collection he was genuinely proud of. For a teenager, those shoes represented something. Time invested. Taste. Identity. Caleb was a few months away from graduation. He should have walked across that stage. He never got the chance. And then there was Gianna Lenzi. Everyone called her she. She was 10 years old. Shemika's daughter. Gloria's granddaughter. By all accounts, she and her grandmother were inseparable. They went everywhere together. Shopping. Movie nights. Quiet evenings curled up on the couch. Their bond was the kind that forms naturally between a grandmother and a grandchild when both of them simply love spending time together. She was 10 years old. She had done nothing wrong to anyone. She was simply home. Robert Short finished his ICU shift at approximately 7:15 in the morning. The drive home took roughly 25 minutes. As he turned onto Bentley Drive and pulled into the driveway, he noticed something immediately. The garage door was open. That alone was unusual. But what stopped him was the cars. Gloria's silver Volkswagen Beetle was gone. So was his GMC Envoy, a truck they hadn't been using much lately because the brakes needed work. Both vehicles. Gone. Robert stepped out of his car and looked into the garage. Hunting arrows from his personal collection were scattered across the floor, knocked over as if someone had moved through the space in a hurry. The attic door was hanging open, the light still on. And near the garage entrance, something else caught his eye. A small spot of blood. He called out. No one answered. Robert pushed through the door connecting the garage to the house. Gloria was lying face down in the hallway. He rushed to her. Checked her pulse. Her skin was already cold. He moved into the living room. She was lying on her back on the floor. She was not moving. No pulse. Robert began running through the house, shouting Caleb's name, checking every room. His son's bedroom was empty. He made it to the master bedroom. Caleb was in the walk-in closet. His hands and feet were bound with tape. No pulse. Robert Short stood in that closet for several minutes. His wife. His granddaughter. His son. All dead. When he finally managed to call 911, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone. The call came in at approximately 7:40 in the morning. Within minutes, patrol officers arrived on scene. What they found was one of the most violent crime scenes in recent Columbus history. All three victims had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head. Both Gloria and she had been restrained with tape. Beside she's body, investigators recovered a 20-pound dumbbell, still coated in dried blood. And Caleb, despite being bound in the closet, had small pieces of grass on his socks. He had been outside at some point before being brought back into the house. The scene appeared, at first glance, to be a burglary gone wrong. But as detectives studied the evidence, a more disturbing picture began to form. This was not random. This was personal. When a husband and father survives a family massacre, investigators are trained to look at him first. That is standard procedure. It is not cruelty. It is statistics. Robert Short was taken to the station. He was questioned for hours. Every detail of his night was examined. Every aspect of his story was tested. He told investigators the same thing repeatedly, calmly, with the flat effect of a man in profound shock. He had been at the hospital. He had come home. He had found them. While Robert sat in that interrogation room, forensic teams were processing the stolen vehicles. GPS tracking data led officers to both the Volkswagen Beetle and the GMC Envoy. They had been abandoned in Oakland Park, a neighborhood several miles from the Short residence. The vehicles were towed and examined under controlled conditions. Technicians sprayed the interiors with luminol, a chemical that reacts with the presence of blood, causing it to glow faintly under ultraviolet light. Both vehicles lit up. Blood on the steering wheel. Blood on the gear shift. Blood on the armrest. Whoever had driven those cars away from Bentley Drive had done so with the victim's blood still on their hands. And inside the back seats? Boxes of shoes. Jordans. Nikes. High-end sneakers, still in their original packaging. Stacked neatly like they had been carefully selected and loaded. Investigators cataloged every item. They photographed everything. DNA swabs were collected from every surface. But they still had no names. No suspects. No direction. That changed 3 days later. On January 7, 2016, Columbus police received a phone call. A woman said she believed her 19-year-old son might be connected to the theft of vehicles from the Short home. She had seen the news coverage. She had heard her son's version of events. And the two did not match. Her son's name was Raheem Gibson. Raheem Gibson was brought in for questioning. He waived his Miranda rights without hesitation. He agreed to talk. And what he described was a sequence of events that had started not with strangers, but with family. Specifically, with a young man named Javari Tapley. Tapley went by a nickname, Weeda. He was Caleb Short's cousin. The two had grown up spending time together. Video games. Family vacations. Holiday gatherings. Caleb trusted him the way you trust someone you've known your whole life. According to Rahim, on the evening of January 3rd, Tapley had reached out and told him to come hang out. Nothing unusual about that. Tapley also mentioned they were going to stop by Caleb's place to see what he had received for Christmas. On the way, the group picked up a third individual, a 15-year-old named Rufus Burks. When they arrived at the Short residence after dark, Tapley told Rahim and Rufus to wait on the side of the house. His reasoning was simple: Caleb wouldn't come out if he saw 3 people standing outside. Rahim stayed back. A few moments later, he heard sounds from the front of the house. He came around and saw Tapley on top of Caleb, restraining him, pinning his arms behind his back on the ground outside. Caleb was screaming. He was asking his cousin why. He was begging. Rahim refused to help. He stepped back into the bushes and sat down. Tapley and Burks dragged Caleb to the rear of the property and forced him inside through a bedroom window. Rahim stayed outside for approximately 30 minutes. Eventually, Burks emerged and told him to get in the car. The Volkswagen Beetle was already loaded with Caleb's shoe collection. Rahim got in the passenger seat. Burks drove. They met up with Tapley later. He was behind the wheel of the GMC Envoy. Rahim kept asking what had happened inside. What had taken so long? Why he had been in there for half an hour. Tapley's response was 3 words. Mind your business. The next morning, Rahim saw the news reports. Triple homicide. Bentley Drive. 3 members of the Short family found dead. He understood then what those 30 minutes had meant. Tapley had not just robbed his cousin. He had murdered him. Along with Gloria. Along with she. Rahim Gibson carried that knowledge for 3 days before his mother made the call. Armed with Rahim's account, investigators moved fast. They pulled phone records. They requested access to deleted text messages. And they obtained a DNA warrant. What they found was damning. Text messages recovered from Tapley's phone showed he had been in contact with Caleb throughout the evening of January 3rd. The messages coordinated the meeting. They established a timeline. And they had been deleted. Tapley had believed they were gone forever. They were not. Digital forensics recovered every word. Social media evidence compounded the picture. Images circulating online showed Tapley and Burks wearing items taken from the Short home. They were posting publicly. They appeared to believe they had gotten away with something. When investigators brought Tapley in for questioning, his story began to fall apart almost immediately. He claimed he barely knew Caleb. Said the two were not close. But Tapley's own grandmother had already spoken to detectives. She told them the opposite. She said the two had spent significant time together. That Tapley had stayed at the Short family home on multiple occasions. That Gloria had purchased clothing for him. That she had treated him as one of her own. Investigators asked Tapley for a DNA sample. He refused. They obtained a search warrant. The results came back quickly. Tapley's DNA was present throughout the Short residence. His fingerprints were recovered from multiple surfaces inside the home. Combined with the recovered text messages, the forensic evidence, and Rahim Gibson's detailed account, the case had transformed from a cold trail into a defined target. On January 10, 2016, Javari Tapley was arrested. He was charged with 3 counts of murder. What came next was not expected. Even by experienced investigators. While awaiting trial in custody, Tapley spoke openly about what he had done. Not in private. Not in whispers. He spoke about it to a cellmate. That cellmate was disturbed enough by what he was hearing that he wrote a letter to law enforcement and requested a meeting with detectives. What Tapley had said, according to his cellmate, went beyond boasting. He expressed no remorse. He stated that he wished he could have done it again. That if given the chance, he would kill them a second time. He made a threat to the cellmate himself, telling him that if he could kill 3 people, he would have no hesitation killing a 4th. And then Tapley revealed something investigators had not anticipated. The original plan had included a fourth victim. Raheem Gibson. Tapley had intended to kill him as well. According to the cellmate, they simply ran out of time. Sit with that for a moment. The young man who had refused to enter the house. The one who had sat in the bushes while the murders were carried out. The one who ultimately picked up the phone and helped detectives solve the case. He had been on the list. Investigators now had a fuller picture of Javari Tapley's mindset going into that night. This was not a robbery that escalated. This was a planned operation. Witnesses were to be eliminated. The only reason one of them survived was circumstance. As for motive, investigators believed it came down to something fundamentally human and deeply corrosive. Jealousy. Tapley had grown up in circumstances that were difficult. He lived with his grandmother. Resources were limited. He had less. And Caleb Short had more. Not dramatically more. Not the kind of wealth that invites envy from a distance. But Caleb had a stable home. 2 parents who showed up. A bedroom with a game system. A shoe collection he was proud of. And in Tapley's mind, that gap was apparently intolerable. Investigators believe the original plan was to lure Caleb outside, restrain him, and take the shoes. But when Tapley entered the house and found Gloria and she present, awake, and aware of what was happening, he made a decision. He killed them. All of them. Including the 10-year-old girl. Because they had seen his face. In 2017, all 3 defendants faced the legal consequences of what had happened on Bentley Drive. Javari Tapley went first. The evidence assembled against him was overwhelming in volume and specificity. DNA. Fingerprints. Recovered text messages he believed were deleted. Witness testimony from Raheem Gibson. And the statements made to his cellmate in custody. Tapley, on the advice of his attorney, entered a guilty plea on 3 counts of malice murder. When the judge issued the sentence, the courtroom was silent. 3 life sentences. Without the possibility of parole. To be served consecutively. Not at the same time. One after the other. Even in the unlikely event one conviction were overturned on appeal, he would still face 2 more life sentences stacked behind it. The judge spoke to the nature of the crime during sentencing. He noted that Tapley had not been a stranger to this family. He had been welcomed inside their home. He had eaten their food. He had accepted their generosity. And he had repaid that trust with an act of extreme violence against a grandmother, a teenager, and a child. Tapley showed no visible emotion as he was led from the courtroom in shackles. He was 20 years old. He will die in prison. Raheem Gibson presented a more complicated calculation for prosecutors. He had been at the scene. He had helped load the stolen shoes into the vehicle. He had driven away from the house knowing what had happened inside. But he had also refused to participate in the violence. He had sat outside while 3 people were killed and had not intervened, but he had also not raised a hand against anyone. And 3 days after the murders, his cooperation with detectives had cracked the case open. Without Raheem Gibson's detailed account, investigators might have had forensic evidence but no narrative. No sequence of events. No names. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of malice murder. Because of his cooperation, and because prosecutors concluded he had not been physically involved in the killings, he received a significantly reduced sentence. 30 years in prison. The decision divided people, including members of the Short family. Some felt justice demanded a harsher punishment. Others understood that his testimony had made Tapley's conviction possible. There is no clean answer. There rarely is. Rufus Burks chose to go to trial. He was the youngest of the 3. Just 15 years old at the time of the murders. His defense presented him as a teenager who had been drawn into a situation he did not fully understand. Someone who had followed Tapley's lead without knowing where it was heading. Someone who had left the scene with Gibson before the murders took place. The prosecution disagreed. They presented evidence that Burks had helped restrain Caleb Short outside the residence. That he had participated in the robbery. That he had driven one of the stolen vehicles away from the scene, blood visible on the steering wheel. And prosecutors showed the jury something that was difficult to reframe. Social media posts. Rufus Burks, in the days following the murders, had been photographed online wearing items taken from the Short home. He had been posting as if nothing had happened. As if 3 people were not dead. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty. On all counts. Burks was convicted of felony murder and kidnapping. Because he was 15 at the time of the crimes, Georgia law prohibited a sentence of life without parole. The judge sentenced him to 2 concurrent life sentences plus an additional 15 years. He will be eligible to seek parole after serving a minimum of 30 years. When the verdict was read, Burks broke down in the courtroom. His family wept. On the other side of the room, the surviving members of the Short family sat in silence. Not because they felt nothing, but because no verdict, no matter how just, returns what was taken. As of today, Javari Tapley remains in a Georgia State Correctional Facility, serving 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will never leave prison. Raheem Gibson is serving 30 years. His cooperation with the investigation is part of the legal record, but it does not undo the choices he made that night. Rufus Burks, convicted on multiple counts as a juvenile offender, will not be eligible to seek parole until he has served at least 3 decades. The Short family home on Bentley Drive continues to stand in the Uppy community. The neighborhood where children once rode bikes freely is still there. But it is not the same. Robert Short, a man who spent 21 years serving his country and years more caring for critically ill patients, drove home from a night shift one morning and lost his entire family in a single moment. He had not even stepped out of his car when he knew something was wrong. What he found inside that house is something no human being should ever have to carry. Some questions do not have clean answers. Even when a case is closed, some things remain. Why did Javari Tapley escalate to murder? Investigators believe the answer is that witnesses could not be left alive. That when he found Gloria and she at home, the calculation changed. But calculations that lead to beating a 10-year-old child to death with a 20-pound dumbbell go beyond strategy. There is something else at work in a mind that can do that. Something that went undetected by the family who trusted him, by the systems that should have caught it. What is also worth asking is this: how did a 19-year-old and a 15-year-old end up in a situation where following someone into a house to commit robbery felt like a reasonable evening? Raheem Gibson sat in the bushes outside while 3 people were killed. He heard Caleb begging. He went home. He knew. And he said nothing for 3 days. That silence cost nothing legally beyond what he was ultimately sentenced for. But it cost something harder to measure. There is also the question of what Gloria Short's generosity means in retrospect. She had welcomed this young man into her life. She had bought him clothing. She had treated him like one of the family. In the minds of her loved ones, that remains one of the most painful details of this entire story. Not because generosity was wrong, but because it was met with something incomprehensible. Gloria Short was 54 years old. She had spent decades feeding people, clothing people, listening to people. Her granddaughter was 10 years old and spent her weekends sitting on the couch beside her grandmother. Her son Caleb was 17. He was weeks away from prom. Months away from graduation. He had his whole life spread out in front of him. They were killed for a collection of shoes. Not for anything they did. Not for any choice they made. Because one person looked at what they had, decided he wanted it, and made a decision that cannot be undone. There are cases in criminal history that are confusing. Cases where motive is complex, where circumstances blur the line between guilt and tragedy, where the full picture is never entirely clear. This is not one of those cases. The motive was documented. The perpetrator confessed in a jail cell that he would do it again. The evidence was comprehensive. The outcome, in legal terms, was decisive. And yet, Robert Short, who spent decades serving others, drove home on a January morning and found his family gone. He will carry that mourning for the rest of his life. There is no sentence, no verdict, no legal outcome that changes that. What we can do, at minimum, is remember. Gloria Short was not a statistic. She was not a footnote. Caleb Short was a teenager with a shoe collection and a graduation date. They deserved the ordinary life they were living. They deserved the ordinary mourning that was taken from them. That is what this case asks us to sit with. Not the monster it produced, but the family it erased.